Imagine being told you can't help your dying mother walk into her own home. That's exactly what happened to David Chen when Karen Mitchell decided a wheelchair ramp violated her neighborhood's aesthetic standards. But what she didn't know was that the HOA president was hiding a secret that would change everything. David had just brought his mom, Margaret, home from the hospital after her latest round of chemotherapy. And the doctors had given them maybe 6 months together, maybe less. And all David wanted was to make those final months comfortable by installing a temporary wooden ramp over the 3 steps leading to his front porch so his mother could actually enter her own home with dignity. He'd submitted all the proper paperwork to the HOA, followed every rule, even chosen a natural wood finish that would blend with his craftsman-style house. But on the morning, the contractors arrived to begin installation. Karen Mitchell came storming across the street in her bright coral blazer like a tornado of entitlement, waving a printed copy of the HOA bylaws and shouting that regulations are regulations, and that David's ramp would destroy property values and set a dangerous precedent. David tried explaining, his voice calm but strained, that his mother had weeks, maybe months, and that the ramp was literally the difference between her living at home versus being trapped inside or worse, forced into a facility. But Karen just crossed her arms, tilted her head with that self-righteous smirk, and said, "Your personal problems don't override community standards, David. And if we make exceptions for you, then everyone will want exceptions." The contractors stood there awkwardly, tools in hand, unsure whether to continue, while David felt his chest tighten with a mixture of rage and helplessness, because how do you reason with someone who values painted wood over human life? His mother, Margaret, sat in her wheelchair at the bottom of those 3 impossible steps, her frail hands folded in her lap, trying to smile and tell David it was okay, that they'd figure something out. But he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the defeat, and something inside him snapped, not into anger, but into determination. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to Rayan Review 2.0 for more real emotional HOA stories. David pulled out his phone and started recording, calmly stating the date, time, and situation, documenting Karen's exact words as she continued her tirade about standards and rules. And within minutes, neighbors started emerging from their homes, drawn by the commotion. And that's when David saw something shift in the crowd. Sympathy, anger, disbelief, because everyone knew Margaret, the sweet woman who used to bake cookies for the neighborhood kids, who always waved from her garden, who never asked for anything from anyone. And now she sat there silent and small, being denied basic human dignity over aesthetics. Karen must have felt the mood turning because she suddenly shifted tactics, her voice taking on a fake sweetness as she said, "Look, I understand this is emotional, but rules exist for a reason. And I've already filed a formal complaint with the HOA, so this installation needs to stop immediately until President Harrison makes a ruling." David's neighbor, Tom, a retired veteran, stepped forward and said quietly, "Karen, what the hell is wrong with you?" And another neighbor, Sarah, added, "This is someone's mother we're talking about." But Karen just huffed, flipped her blonde highlights, and declared, "I'm protecting all of our investments," before marching back to her pristine yellow house across the street. David spent that entire day carrying his mother up and down those steps, literally lifting her fragile body in his arms, each trip a painful reminder of what Karen had done. And that night, he couldn't sleep, lying awake wondering how someone could be so cruel, so completely devoid of empathy, until finally he decided to attend the emergency HOA meeting Karen had demanded, determined to fight for his mother's basic rights. If you're feeling this story, hit that like button and share this video to support Rayan Review 2.0. The meeting room was packed 3 days later, standing room only. Neighbors who never attended HOA meetings suddenly showing up because word had spread. And David sat in the front row, his prepared statement trembling slightly in his hands, while Karen sat smugly on the opposite side, her coral blazer practically glowing under the fluorescent lights, clearly expecting vindication. President Robert Harrison entered looking more serious than usual, his gray suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. and he called the meeting to order with a heavy formality that made everyone lean forward in anticipation. Karen went first, presenting her case with dramatic flair, citing bylaw sections about exterior modifications, showing printed photos of David's house with measurements and angles, arguing that allowing unapproved structures opens the door to chaos, and that compassion cannot override legal contracts. And when she finished, she actually smiled, confident she'd won. Then David stood, his voice steady despite the emotion, and he didn't talk about bylaws or property values. He talked about his mother, about how she'd worked as a nurse for 40 years, helping others, never complaining, and how all she wanted was to spend her final months in the home she loved, surrounded by memories, not staring at institutional walls. And he asked the room a simple question. What kind of community are we if we value paint color over human life? The room was silent. You could hear people breathing, and several neighbors were wiping their eyes. But Karen just rolled her eyes and muttered something about emotional manipulation. That's when President Harrison stood. And instead of delivering a ruling, he did something unexpected. He started talking about his own mother, how she'd passed away 5 years ago from ALS, how he'd installed a ramp at his previous home, how those final months of caring for her were the most meaningful of his life, and suddenly his voice cracked slightly. And you could see this wasn't just business anymore, this was personal. Want to hear more life-changing HOA tales every week? Subscribe to Rayan Review 2.0 and never miss the next twist. Harrison then revealed something that made Karen's face go pale. She herself had violated HOA bylaws 6 times in the past 3 years. An unapproved garden shed, a fence extension, a mailbox replacement, a driveway repaving without permits, a satellite dish installation, and exterior paint color that was 2 shades off regulation. And each time, the HOA board had quietly approved her modifications retroactively because they were reasonable requests, because the board believed in common sense over rigid bureaucracy, because they understood that communities are made of people, not just property values. So, Karen, Harrison said, his gray eyes steady and unflinching, when you stood in David's driveway demanding strict adherence to rules, where was that energy when you installed your shed without approval? When you extended your fence? When you changed your paint color? The room erupted in murmurs, neighbors turning to look at Karen, whose face had gone from confident to mortified, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. And someone in the back actually laughed. A bitter sound that captured everyone's disbelief at the hypocrisy. Harrison continued, explaining that the HOA board had reviewed David's request and found it completely reasonable. Temporary installation, tasteful design, legitimate medical necessity, full removal guaranteed within 1 year or upon property sale, and that the ramp was approved unanimously, effective immediately, with a waiver of all installation fees as a gesture of community support. But then Harrison did something that elevated him from administrator to true leader. He looked directly at Karen and said, "However, I want to address something bigger here, because this isn't really about a ramp, is it? This is about what we value, who we are as neighbors, as human beings. And Karen, I want you to think about something. Someday, you might need help. You might face a crisis. And when that day comes, you'll want your neighbors to choose compassion over rules. Empathy over regulations, humanity over paperwork. So I'm asking you now, in front of everyone, to consider whether this is the legacy you want to leave, whether this is who you want to be." The room was dead silent, everyone waiting for Karen's response, and for a moment, you could see something flicker across her face. Shame. Realization, maybe even regret. But instead of apologizing, instead of showing any growth, she grabbed her papers, stood up abruptly, and walked out, her heels clicking against the floor, the door slamming behind her like a child throwing a tantrum, and the room collectively exhaled, a mixture of relief and disappointment that she couldn't even own her mistake. David was overwhelmed, thanking Harrison with tears in his eyes, shaking hands with neighbors who'd supported him, feeling that rare sensation of community actually working the way it should. And the next morning, the contractors returned and completed the ramp in 4 hours, a beautiful, simple wooden structure that meant everything. The neighborhood rallied around David and Margaret in ways he never expected. Tom organized a meal train. Sarah set up a visiting schedule so Margaret was never alone. Other neighbors helped with yard work and errands. And even though Margaret only lived another 4 months, those were 4 months filled with dignity, comfort, and love. 4 months where she could wheel herself onto her porch and feel the... Not once, though, neighbors reported she became quieter, less visible. Her usual complaints suddenly absent from HOA meetings. And some people said they saw her pause sometimes when walking past David's house, staring at that ramp with an expression nobody could quite read. Regret? Embarrassment? Understanding that came too late? David never found out because he avoided her, focusing instead on treasuring every moment with his mother. And when Margaret finally passed peacefully in her sleep one autumn morning, surrounded by photos and flowers and love, David knew he'd done everything possible to honor her. And that ramp, that simple wooden structure Karen had fought so hard against, became a symbol of everything good about community, about choosing humanity over bureaucracy, about standing up for what's right even when rules say otherwise. At Margaret's memorial service, which was held in the neighborhood clubhouse and attended by nearly 50 neighbors, President Harrison gave a short speech about how Margaret had taught them all a lesson about grace, dignity, and the importance of community supporting its members. And he announced that the HOA board had voted to establish the Margaret Chen Compassion Clause, a permanent bylaw addition that would allow for expedited approval of medical necessity modifications, ensuring no family would ever face what David had faced again. The ramp stayed up for 3 more months after Margaret's passing. David couldn't bring himself to remove it immediately, and during that time, something unexpected happened. Neighbors started leaving flowers at its base, small tokens of remembrance, notes of gratitude, and David realized that his mother's final gift wasn't just those 4 months of dignity, but a permanent change in how the community saw itself, a shift from rules to compassion, from property values to human values. When David finally did remove the ramp, he donated the wood to a local organization that built accessible structures for low-income families, because that's what his mother would have wanted. And as he watched the last board come off, he felt not sadness but pride that he'd fought for her, pride that the community had risen to support them, and pride that even in death, his mother had made the neighborhood a better, kinder place. Thanks for watching Rayan Review 2.0, where every story teaches a lesson. Like, share, and subscribe for more emotional neighborhood dramas, because the moral here isn't complicated. Rules matter, but people matter more. And any community that forgets that isn't really a community at all. It's just addresses on a map. So the next time you're tempted to prioritize regulations over humanity, think about Margaret Chen, think about that ramp, and ask yourself what kind of neighbor you want to be when someone's dignity hangs in the balance.